Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. As Canada faces significant economic pressure from the imposition of 35% tariffs and global levies on its goods, potentially sparking unity among provinces and First Nations. While retaliatory tariffs could be considered, it's unclear if they would resolve the issue. Critics argue that Mark Carney's approach, including not responding robustly to Trump's tariff threats, undermines his position. Public sentiment is divided between Carney and Trudeau, with questions over Canada's future trade relations, particularly with India under Carney's leadership. Joining us now is Martha Hall Lindlay, a prominent Canadian political figure who has played a key role in shaping the Liberal Party. She first entered the national spotlight in 2004, challenging Conservative candidate Belinda Stronach in the Newmarket Orola riding. Hall Lindlay went on to become the Liberal candidate for Willowdale, where she secured a by-election win in 2008. She ran for Liberal Party leadership in 2006 and again in 2013. Finishing behind Justin Trudeau, post-politics, she became the CEO of the Canada West Foundation and later Chief Sustainability Officer at Suncor. How does the likely imposition of 35% targeted tariffs and global levies on Canadian goods impact Canadian economy?
Well, first off, there are a number of factors at play. One is we actually do have a deal. It is called the USMCA or CUSMA, as the Canadians call it. And so that's the law of the land. And so we're dealing with a president who apparently seems to have forgotten that. And so now we're all talking about, negotiating a deal. The color that puts on all of this is that how much faith does one have negotiating any kind of a deal when we actually already have one? And so there's always this uncertainty. And I think what we've seen globally over the last few months is that it's not just Donald Trump wanting to throw out a deal and negotiate another one. He himself keeps changing his mind. And so the level of uncertainty is frankly almost as challenging to Canadian businesses as a specific tariff. Not that we want any tariffs, of course, because we do have a mostly tariff-free arrangement under the current arrangement. But yes, now we already know that the tariffs on aluminum and steel are very damaging. We know that some of the others that are being imposed are damaging as well to the Canadian economy. What's also very important to remember, especially for the folks who are negotiating, is that the people who are actually being hurt the most, especially when you're putting tariffs on raw inputs like aluminum and steel, the people who are hurting financially are the American manufacturers who need those products. So yes, it hurts the Canadian economy, but it's far more damaging to those in the United States who need those products as inputs to the goods that they're manufacturing. So there's all this added complication. In some ways, our best allies in negotiating anything with the United States are in fact those Americans, right? And so how much influence they might have in Washington is uncertain. I mean, everything is uncertain. The other thing I would say is that the Canadian economy has, some of us in the policy world have been talking about these challenges for decades. Our productivity numbers are not good, and they're getting worse all the time relative to the countries that we normally compare ourselves to, the OECD countries. Our dependence on the United States is obvious in terms of export markets. We're a very trade-dependent country. Trade is a very big part of our economy. Most of it is dependent on the United States. That will never change because geography, we can't change geography. But it is an encouragement to diversify and look at expanding to other markets, especially in the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. So those are things we have internal trade barriers. It's harder to sell some products and services within Canada than it is within the European Union. Those are things that we have to deal with as Canadians, not because of Trump, but because they're things we need to do for our own economy. So there are a variety of layers to all of these economic questions.
Has this spearheaded provinces come together, First Nations to come together, First Nations?
A number of people are credited with saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. We do have a problem with Donald Trump, without question. But as I said, some of these economic challenges are Canada's, not because of Donald Trump. They're challenges that we have in our own economy. So this, in fact, is an opportunity for us to really look in the mirror and say, we have problems of our own. So in the course of dealing with the economic challenges posed by Donald Trump, this is an opportunity for us as a country, as a set of the 10 provincial premiers, the representatives of the 3 territories, all having an opportunity to work together. And yes, it's an incentive for them to do so. And it's terrific, in fact, to see everyone rising to the occasion. I think you also have a dynamic where we had the government in Canada the last 10 years under Justin Trudeau really had a habit of overstepping its bounds. We have a very interesting constitution in Canada. We're the most decentralized federation in the world, in fact. Not just because we're really big geographically, but because we have all these different provincial jurisdictions. And the Constitution is very clear about what are the provincial responsibilities, and very clear about what are the federal responsibilities. And for the last 10 years, a number of provinces, especially Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, very upset at a federal government that seemed to be, not swimming in its own lane, if you will. And we have a new Prime Minister in Mark Carney who really seems to understand the importance of the federal government restricting what it does to federal affairs, which, by the way, includes international trade negotiations, but also the importance of the provinces being responsible for their own. And what that means is that there's an automatically greater level of respect for the provinces. That in turn helps the provinces come together at this meeting that's starting today, this 3-day meeting, with a much greater level of collaboration and cooperation. It's not going to be easy. Don't get me wrong. The internal trade barriers among the provinces have been around for a long time, and they won't be easy to remove. But at least there's a will on the part of the federal government to help, not force, and very much a will on the part of the provinces to actually work together and with the federal government. So, we have to be cautious. None of this is going to be easy, but there's no question. I think, ironically, Donald Trump has helped Canada really understand we need to do this for our own sake, get our own house in order as a country.
How must Canada respond? Should it impose retaliatory tariffs, or will it solve the problem?
Well, first, I think there's a level of respect in the relationship that we didn't have with the prior Prime Minister, and I think that's very important. I think that's also very important for the people around Trump. There's no question there's respect amid larger global respect for Mark Carney. So many of the world leaders already know him because of his work as the governor of the Bank of Canada, but then, of course, the governor of Bank of England. And so that's just an automatic opportunity to start at a level that's a bit different. I think we have to be clear. My own belief is to not keep talking about negotiating a new deal, because we have one. And I think it's really important to remind the Americans that we already have a North America trade arrangement that is still the law of the land. And so we want to be able to work with that as closely as possible. And I think that's working. Just recently, Trump and Carney had agreed to try and figure something out by July 21st, I think. That hasn't happened. Trump then moved that to early August, I think August 1st. I mean, it's Donald Trump. He's going to change his mind all the time anyway. But these are the things that we're living with. But my sense is that we still have to be we're the smaller player. We don't have the leverage, but we are important to the United States in many ways. Allies in these discussions are, in fact, the Americans that are suffering because of these tariffs. Um, we have an incredibly integrated auto manufacturing sector. You know, a car will go across the border in the sense of, you know, different parts and different pieces of the process go back and forth before a final car is built, you know, 6, 7, 10 times. And so it's extraordinarily integrated. Those are things that benefit the American sector as much as they benefit the Canadian. So highlighting the areas where we are important, highlighting the areas where we actually benefit mutually is much more important, I think, than some of the easier political, you know, we're going to stand up and be tough. We don't have that luxury in Canada. We're just not big enough, and we just don't have that economic power. So I think what I've seen with Prime Minister Carney is he's being very calm, he's being deliberate, he's being respectful. And that I think is very important in terms of whatever discussions are happening and continue to happen over the next while.
Do you feel there has been limited retaliation from Carney against Trump tariffs threats versus the time when he was campaigning to win the election against Trump's tariff threats and making Canada the 51st state?
One, it's incredibly complicated, and I don't know who would have the right answer because we have a U.S. president who is so changeable and so volatile. I would say one of the changes that happened just recently was Trump all of a sudden coming out and saying, "Oh, but we won't charge tariffs on CUSMA compliant. We'll only charge the tariffs on non-CUSMA compliant goods." Well, there is paperwork, there's process that needs to be done, and a lot of Canadian companies are rushing to get that done. It all has to do with proving how much North American content is in the product that you're selling to the United States. This is related in a way to the concerns about China and worrying that China is going to use Canada or Mexico as a conduit for goods. And so, you know, having something that's CUSMA compliant, which shows a significant majority of Canadian content, if you will, North American content, that accounts, you know, several reports say that accounts for, you know, 80% plus of Canadian goods. So, you know, we actually have an opportunity to be one of the least tariffed countries in the world right now with the United States. So, was that thanks to the ongoing discussions between Trump and Carney? I can't help but think that was a big part of that. And that's in fact of real benefit to Canada. Um, I think what we've seen with Trump is he doesn't like to be contradicted. He doesn't like to, he doesn't respond well to the, you know, standing up to him. And so I think for Canada to recognize that we are much smaller, we're much more dependent on the United States than the United States is on us. There are various other factors at play. So you know, the Arctic, what are we going to do in the Arctic? The buildup of the Russians in the Arctic to our north is of concern. What will China do in the Arctic? What will we do in terms of sovereignty, in terms of mutual defense? All of these issues are intertwined. And so I would say that right now, Prime Minister Carney is doing about as well as can be. Even on the digital sales tax, there are different perspectives, but I'm definitely of the group that a few years ago said Canada should not impose this alone. There's a whole group of countries that are actually trying to figure out how to do this in collaboration. They still haven't come to a final position, but Canada broke away on its own and said, we're going to impose this anyway. And we knew there were many of us who knew that this was going to become a major irritant for the United States. Was the recent turnaround on purpose as part of a bargaining thing? You know, we brought in $1.3 billion worth of effort to enhance the border, greater border security. The fentanyl problem fentanyl is a huge problem, but the amount of fentanyl crossing the Canadian border into the United States is minuscule compared to, for example, what's coming in from Mexico. So it was a bit of a red herring, but Canada responded and said, we understand you keep saying this is a concern. We'll respond. I would say right now, given the volatility of Donald Trump, given all of the other things that are going on, I mean, there are wars, there are you know, and obviously Donald Trump, the United States, is more involved in some of those than Canada is. And I just think there's an awful lot of discussion going on behind the scenes that if you have a serious, clearly capable person as Prime Minister of Canada, you don't want to be the armchair quarterbacks. I think it's important for us to say, look, he's serious. He's respected. He has a pretty good idea of how to work with world leaders. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Now, what is the current sentiment of the people, Trudeau versus Carney?
I think it's pretty unanimous that it's an improvement. It was, I mean, the numbers, the polling numbers before the last election when Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister were incredibly in favor of the Conservatives. The fact that Mark Carney brought the Liberals to almost a majority is an indication of, I think, a much greater level of respect for Mark Carney, especially in a time of real concern, right, that's been caused by Donald Trump. So I think people are there isn't buyer's remorse at this point. I think depending on where you are in the country, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Western Canada, there is there's optimism, but it's cautious. The last 10 years have been very, very challenging for Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular because of the last government, the Trudeau government, and policies. I mentioned earlier, way too many examples of the federal government imposing things on the provinces and creating real problems. The optimism is there because Mark Carney is saying the right things. He's put in a few ministers into his cabinet, Tim Hodgson for natural resources, as an example, inspiring a lot of confidence. But it's cautious because people are hearing what they want to hear, but we're not necessarily seeing the action. And you mentioned the meeting with Indigenous leaders, a very big Bill C5 in the federal parliament to encourage big major projects to be built more quickly, more efficiently, has made a number of Indigenous communities and leaders very nervous. Those discussions have to continue. My world, really being Western Canada and seeing energy companies really in the last 10, 15 years totally working with Indigenous communities in a much more productive, much more collaborative way. We will be able to do this in Canada, but you have the rhetoric, you have we're trying to act, but maybe that was a bit too soon, and we didn't engage with the Indigenous communities early, beforehand. So there's an element of we need the Prime Minister to act, but we need to make sure he doesn't act on some of these things too quickly because that can actually create other problems. I honestly, again, I'm giving the government benefit of the doubt. There's so much going on. I have a lot of faith in Mark Carney as a person, as somebody who's very thoughtful and smart and able to work through these things. I think he knows that we're going to have to see concrete things happening fairly soon in order for people to not get too nervous.
What is the future of India and Canada under the current president, Mark Carney?
I see it very positively. And I can guarantee an awful lot of Canadians do. As I said, in different parts of the country, the optimism might be a bit more cautious in wanting to see, real things happening as opposed to just the right language. I think Mark Carney and his government also has to make sure that that the different parts of the country and the different parts of the population that voted for him and voted for them aren't necessarily all in agreement on everything, right? You have very strong environmental activists, you have very strong, pro-oil and gas folks, you have Indigenous communities, you have, and there, there are many Indigenous communities across the country, and they're very different. This idea of some homogeneous view is completely false. And so managing all of those relationships.
Thank you, Martha Hall Lindlay, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of the Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned with NewsX World.